Anyhow, I got back to Vineland and picked the J5 up and headed for Georgia with it, in good weather and everything. Little tailwinds, I remember, no problem going west, and the weather was so smooth that I was flying. They had no radios of any kind, navigation or communication, anything, and I was flying along for quite a ways down into, I believe it was into South Carolina, no, probably North Carolina, somewhere that I was so smooth, and I was been there a couple of hours and everything was going fine, and the old J5 is so steady, it was just sitting there like a train on a track, and I went to sleep and didn't realize it until all of a sudden something changed, and I just woke up with a start. The first time I realized I'd been asleep, and realized something had changed, and I sat there and didn't budge, just looked around to see what had fallen off or what happened, and I looked around the cockpit and I looked and looked and looked, and I couldn't find anything different. The wings were level, the nose was level, everything was the same, and I knew something, and it just began to turn in my mind. I knew something had changed and I didn't know what, and that worried me. So I looked and looked and looked, and I finally looked at the RPM a little harder and realized that it was turning 2150 RPM. And then I remembered that I had been cruising at 2200 RPM. And so what had happened was it dropped 50 RPM, and that's what caused me to start and wake up. And so I looked, and it was running all right, and I moved the throttle a little bit, and it ran up and back all right, no problem, but it just wasn't quite as powerful, obviously. So I didn't know what, but figured something was going wrong with the mag or plugs. And so I wasn't too far. I don't remember now how far, probably 20 miles or something, just a few minutes. I saw an airport ahead. I was on my course line on the chart, and so I kept going to that and got over it, stayed at altitude. I was pretty high because there was a real hazy time in the Smoky Mountains, and I couldn't see very far, so I stayed high. Fortunately, I got right over the airport and cut the power and spiraled down, landed at the airport, and fortunately found a mechanic there and told him that my RPM had dropped. Now I looked at the mags and plugs and things, and he did, and found one of the mags had misfire. Oh, I forgot to say before I checked the mechanic when I first landed. Then I checked the mags. I didn't even check the mags in the air because I wasn't sure it would turn on again if it turned off. So I didn't fool with it until it landed. And then when I got there and checked them, and one of the mags didn't work, so I told him that, and he checked and took the back cover off the mag and found the mag contact spring. It looked like car contacts. The spring had just broken. Unfortunately, he had one, put it in there, and ran fine, and I took off, headed back to Georgia, and had no further problems with the trip. So that was a pretty interesting, to me, event, because I was asleep, one, and secondly, that I'd noticed that 50 RPM drop, even though I was asleep. Just anything shifted, and that got me alert. And so that was the J5 trip. And so I got back to Atlantic City probably the same way and picked up that T50. And that T50, I have to describe when I first got that T50, that had flown it off that airport. And when I first took off, the fabric, that's a fabric covered wing, big wing, and a big old twin engine airplane, as you know about a T50. And as soon as you take off down the runway, out of the corner of your eye, you see something changing on the wings, and you look at it, and between every rib, there's about 12 inches of fabric there, and the fabric is just blowing up just like that. The fabric was Irish linen, and original apparently on that thing, and in 1954 that would make it 10 years old, roughly, wartime airplane, and the fabric was just, the dope on it was just porous. You could almost pour water through it, it was so porous, but the air was coming out of it. But as long as the airplane was light, why, it was enough lift to get it off. All out the wing, was between every rib, it was just like this, that thing. As soon as you pick up speed to get lift, and I looked at that, and it all held, and didn't see any holes, cracks, or anything, so I kept on going and got that thing to Georgia.
There was rib stitching?
Yeah, rib stitching held to the ribs, but in between the ribs was nothing, and just the slack fabric and the air flowing through there. I'm sure it was not lifting as much as I should have, but it flew okay because I was by myself and had full fuel, but it was by myself. So I flew it back to Georgia. And I knew this now. I'm not saying that was the first time I'd seen it do that. When we flew it locally around Vineland Airport, had done that, but we hadn't gone very far from the airport, so didn't worry about it till then. Didn't have any money to fix it anyhow. Didn't want to. It'd be expensive to recover that thing. And so flew it on back to Georgia and landed at Fulton County Airport in Atlanta and parked it out there. And I had gotten a job at Delta by then, and I had to go off on a trip for Delta right away. So I put an ad in Trade Plane to sell that piece of junk, and didn't think anybody would buy it. So I think, as I remembered, I put $625 in it, on it, and so I went off on my trip in Delta, and Saturday night, I was somewhere probably in Miami on that Delta run, and Gene called me and said, there's a guy on the phone that wants to buy that airplane. And I said, you sure? Did he really say he wanted to buy it? He said, well, he's a crop duster and he's in Mississippi, and he said he'll fly in here if I'll pick him up at the Atlanta airport and take him to see the airplane. He'll give me $625 for it. And I said, sell it to him quick. So she told him okay, and he came on and she picked him up, carried him out to the Fulton airport, and she said he got out of the car, and she parked there, and he got out of the car and walked around. Didn't slow down, just walked around it and looked at everything, and walked over to the car and handed her $625. And I told her, when you get your hand on that money, you clamp down on it and take off. And she didn't. She stayed there till he walked around, and she said he went off and got a whole case of oil and started putting oil in it, filled the oil up, and I guess checked the fuel, I don't know. I had left a little fuel in it, and got in it, and cranked it up so that the battery worked. It hadn't been too long since it run, and it cranked up right away. And she said he turned around and taxied out, and took off down the runway. And she took off in the car, and that was the end of that, and we got the $625. That was a real bargain to us at the time, because that thing, of course, it's today, for instance, that T50 in the shape it was in, the engines were good, and had two controllable props. T50s were made with wood props, and the two controllable props are each worth at least $500 if you had to buy them, even then. And so the engines were good, and the airframe and the wing, everything was good except the fabric. The fabric was the only thing that was bad. So it wasn't, in those days it wasn't worth any more, but today it would have been worth a whole lot more. Yeah. So it was pretty interesting. Never heard from him again, so I guess it got him to Mississippi. And then in those days, people were using those airplanes for dusters, so I guess he had a use for it. Yeah. Probably it was a good buy for him, I don't know. Yeah. That was the end of that T50. That was the first one I owned. We later got another one, but that was a good airplane. The T50s, I have to insert here, the T50s are not like the UC-78s. You got to know a little bit about Cessnas to know this, but the T50 originally cruised at 150, and the UC-78s originally, the same airplane, cruised at 125. And the difference was that T50s were the original Cessna factory production of that airplane, and the UC-78s were the same production, but at the end of the production line, the Air Force, to accept them as UC-78s, had the Cessna insert a shim at the trailing edge of the stabilizer, which was a one-piece big spar, wood spar stabilizer, and the fuselage was chromoly tubing, and it had a seat there for that stab spar to go across, and they made them take just two bolts out of that right where it held it down there and put in a 1 5/8 wood shim. Now, 1 5/8 times the width of that stab, which I don't know what it was, but it made a considerable up angle on it. And the Air Force did that because, not the Air Force, I keep saying the Air Force. It was the Air Force. I got that part of the story wrong. The UC-78 didn't do that. The FAA did this after the war, when UC-78s were recertified over to civilian flying again. If you wanted to do that, you had to do, the FAA required you put this 1 5/8 shim under the stab. And the FAA did that because they said that you didn't have enough elevator to get a full 3-point landing. And the FAA's, I'd say, lack of knowledge, but I'm not going to criticize them at this point, that's what they thought was safe and proper that a tailwheel airplane should be able to land 3-point. And it wouldn't do that. I admit the T50 wouldn't. You couldn't get the tail down unless you put on a little bit of power to make the elevator a little more powerful, and then you'd push it down. You could make it do it, but it didn't do it normally, so they made you put that shim in there. And so this airplane had been subjected to that shim because the U-78 had to have it, and this was, although it was a civil model, it was a T-50 originally, and so they came around and made them put it in too because it's the same airplane. They figured it ought to have it. Of course, they had flown originally without it, but now they couldn't do it. Anyhow, it had the shim, and so it was cruising at very slow, 125 all the way from New Jersey. When we later got another T-50, the first thing we did was didn't tell the FAA, if they're listening, that's kind of illegal, but the first thing we did was take that shim out of there. All you had to do was take 2 bolts out and push that wood shim out of the way and put 2 bolts back in. It was back exactly how it was, just wooden 3-point. So that made a good knowledge for us when we got that second one. Of course, that second one we got was, let's see, that would be 8 years later. It had a crack in the main wood spar, and the wood spar in that T-50 wing is one-piece wing, great big wood spar. Gosh, I don't know how deep it was. It must have been nearly 2 feet deep at the center and tapered out to the tips. And it was made from Northwest Sitka spruce and laminated layers all the way full length of that wing, 50-foot wingspan. That's a big wing. I mean, the spar was cracked in the center section of this airplane, and so my good friend Bob Rust, who was our partner in Southeast Aeromotive at Fulton County, we got that thing and took one of the T-hangers there and put it in nose first, and put a tarp on both sides of the fuselage and pull it around the fuselage to keep the heat in the middle of the winter, and put some kerosene heaters in there and heated that hanger up and got it warm, and then started shaving out with a planer, rotary planer, and shaved out all wood splices have to be 1:32 angle, and we had to shave out that spar 1:32 both ways, which came out to as far as the engine on both sides, from the center to the engines on both sides with a big V in there. And then Bob got some of that spruce and made another spar, laminated it, and made another spar that fit in there, and we spent 6 months in that heated hanger smoothing that so they fit good, so the glue would hold. And we got it good and hot in there and mixed up some glue and pushed that spar up in there and clamped it and left it for 3 days and took that out like a new airplane then. That was a big job. Bob was an excellent mechanic. He knew how to do that. Wasn't any problem. Later sold that airplane, but in the meantime we fixed the spar, and then the rest of it was good. So that was my experience with T-50s.